"Ma'am, step away from the coffin right now." The metallic click of a handgun safety cut through the rain louder than the church bells echoing across Arlington National Cemetery. Conversation stopped instantly. Boots froze against wet gravel. Even the wind seemed to pull back for a second as dozens of mourners turned toward the sound. Officer Ryan Keller stood near the front row of black SUVs, his arm extended, his jaw tight beneath the brim of his rain-darkened police cap. The funeral escort lights painted flashes of blue and red across the polished marble headstones, while cold October rain dripped from the barrel pointed toward a black woman dressed in a long charcoal coat beside the casket. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She only tightened her fingers around the folded military flag resting against her chest. A little boy near the back grabbed his mother's sleeve and whispered something nobody heard over the thunder rolling above the cemetery hills. The woman slowly lifted her eyes toward the officer. Calm eyes. Exhausted eyes. The kind of eyes that looked like they had already survived things worse than humiliation. Rainwater slid down the side of her face, but she didn't wipe it away. Around her, rows of Army personnel stood beneath gray skies in perfect formation, their dress uniforms darkened by the storm. Gold buttons gleamed under the muted afternoon light. The air smelled like wet earth, cold stone, and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler lowered his trumpet halfway through taps, uncertainty flickering across his face as tension spread through the funeral like a crack through glass. Ryan Keller took another step forward, his polished boots splashing into a shallow puddle beside the burial platform. "I said move away from the coffin." He barked again, louder this time, his voice carrying over the rain. "This area is restricted to immediate military family only." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly veteran shifted beneath his umbrella as if he wanted to say something, but didn't. The woman beside the casket looked down at the engraved name on the polished wood for one brief second before speaking softly. "He was my brother." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It sounded tired. Deeply tired. Ryan's eyes narrowed. "Then where's your identification?" he demanded. "Because nobody here knows who you are." The woman inhaled slowly, almost painfully, as though the grief in her chest weighed more than the rain-soaked coat hanging from her shoulders. Her black gloves trembled slightly against the folded flag, but her posture never broke. Behind her, rows of white headstones stretched across the rolling hills like silent witnesses beneath the storm clouds. The funeral had already been delayed twice because of weather, and mourners stood shoulder to shoulder beneath umbrellas, while camera crews from local news stations waited near the entrance gates for the military procession to end. Ryan glanced toward them briefly before returning his attention to the woman. Something about her calmness irritated him more than fear would have. Most people apologized when confronted by police authority. Most people stepped back. But she remained standing beside the coffin like she belonged there more than anyone else in the cemetery. Rain drummed softly against the American flag draped across the casket between them. "Last warning," Ryan said sharply, adjusting his grip. "Move away now." The woman finally lifted her chin completely, revealing a small silver pin near the collar of her coat almost hidden beneath the rain. The nearby soldiers noticed it first. One young lieutenant's face changed instantly. His spine straightened. Another soldier beside him looked again, then slowly lowered his umbrella altogether despite the rain pouring down his uniform. And somewhere behind the front rows of mourners, an older general with silver hair suddenly stopped walking mid-step the moment his eyes landed on the woman standing beside the coffin with a gun pointed at her chest. The older general stopped beside the front row of mourners, rain sliding down the brim of his service cap as his eyes locked onto the woman near the casket. For a brief second, the entire cemetery seemed suspended in silence. Even Officer Ryan Keller hesitated when he noticed the expression on the old man's face change from confusion to disbelief. The general's breathing slowed visibly. His posture stiffened. Then, without saying a single word, he raised his right hand sharply into a military salute. The motion was immediate and instinctive, the kind born from decades of discipline. Several soldiers nearby noticed at once. One by one, heads turned back toward the woman standing in the rain. A young Marine captain lowered his umbrella entirely and straightened his spine. Another officer followed. Then another. Within seconds, The soft rustling of uniforms moved through the funeral crowd like a wave as rows of servicemen and women slowly lifted their hands into salute toward the black woman Officer Keller still held at gunpoint. Ryan blinked hard, confusion flickering across his face. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice losing some of its certainty. Nobody answered him immediately. The woman finally lowered her eyes toward the folded flag in her hands again, her fingers brushing carefully across the embroidered stars as though she were afraid the memory attached to it might disappear if she let go. Rainwater dripped steadily from the ends of her dark curls onto the sleeves of her coat. Up close, exhaustion showed in every part of her face. Not weakness, grief, the kind that hollowed a person quietly from the inside out. Near the burial tent, a military chaplain removed his glasses slowly and stared toward her with visible recognition. A whisper spread through the gathered officers. "That is General Naomi Carter." The words traveled softly at first, almost disbelieving. Then another voice repeated it louder. "Four-star General Naomi Carter." Ryan's arm lowered an inch before stiffening again. "No," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the nearby officers as if expecting someone to correct them. But nobody did. The older general stepped forward through the rain, polished metals glinting faintly beneath the gray sky. His expression carried something deeper than respect. It carried shame. "General Carter," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I did not know you would attend in person." Naomi finally looked up at him. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, but her voice remained calm. "He was my younger brother, Thomas," she answered softly. "There was nowhere else I would be." Several mourners lowered their heads after hearing her say it aloud. A woman near the back covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The funeral program tucked beneath her arm suddenly made sense now. Sergeant First Class Elijah Carter, Bronze Star recipient, killed during a rescue operation overseas 3 weeks earlier. Ryan swallowed hard as pieces around him began falling into place too late. He looked again at the woman's silver collar pin, now visible beneath the rain-soaked fabric of her coat. 4 tiny silver stars. Real silver stars. His heartbeat thudded heavily in his ears. The gun in his hand suddenly felt heavier than before. Naomi noticed his stare, but said nothing about it. She only turned slightly toward the casket again as the rain softened into a cold mist drifting across the cemetery hills. "He hated storms," she whispered quietly, almost to herself. "Ever since we were kids in Louisiana." The older general's face tightened with emotion. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the honor guard has been waiting for your signal." Ryan looked around at the soldiers standing rigidly in salute toward the woman he had treated like an intruder only moments earlier. Nobody was looking at him anymore. Not the reporters near the gates. Not the officers. Not even the mourners. Their attention had shifted entirely toward Naomi Carter, the grieving sister standing alone beside her brother's coffin beneath the rain-darkened sky. And for the first time since arriving at the cemetery that afternoon, Officer Ryan Keller began to realize he had made a mistake far larger than his pride could contain. The rain eased into a fine gray mist as members of the honor guard moved carefully into position around Elijah Carter's casket. Their white gloves gleamed against the dark afternoon while the sound of distant thunder rolled softly across the hills beyond the cemetery. General Naomi Carter stood motionless beside the coffin, one hand resting lightly against the folded flag pressed to her chest. She looked smaller now somehow, not because of fear, but because grief had stripped away every layer of rank and recognition until only a sister remained beneath the storm. Officer Ryan Keller slowly lowered his weapon completely, though his fingers still hovered awkwardly around it, as if he no longer knew what to do with his own hands. The air around him had changed. Just minutes earlier, he had stood tall with the confidence of authority. Now every glance from the soldiers nearby felt heavy enough to bend his shoulders downward. A young army sergeant near the front finally broke formation long enough to approach Naomi quietly. He could not have been older than 23. Rain dripped from the brim of his dress cap as he held out a small silver object with trembling fingers. "Ma'am," he said softly. "They recovered this from Sergeant Carter's locker overseas." Naomi looked down slowly. It was an old wristwatch scratched across the glass face, the leather strap faded nearly white from age. Her breath caught for the first time all afternoon. Carefully, she reached out and took it into her gloved hand. My father gave this to him when he turned 16, she whispered. The young sergeant nodded. He carried it every mission. Naomi closed her fingers around the watch tightly. For several seconds, she could not speak at all. The older general standing beside her lowered his eyes respectfully, while nearby soldiers remained perfectly still despite the cold rain soaking through their uniforms. Ryan watched the exchange from several feet away, unease crawling deeper into his chest. He glanced toward the reporters gathered near the cemetery gates. Some had already lowered their cameras out of discomfort, while others whispered urgently into microphones. He realized then that dozens of phones had recorded what happened minutes earlier. The image flashed through his mind with sudden clarity. A grieving black woman standing beside her brother's casket while he shouted at her beneath flashing police lights. His stomach tightened hard. Officer Keller. The voice came sharp from behind him. He turned quickly to find Captain Elena Ruiz from military police approaching through the wet grass, with 2 federal officers beside her. Her expression was unreadable. Step over here, please. Ryan forced a stiff nod and followed several feet away from the funeral gathering. Water soaked through the edges of his uniform pants with every step. Captain Ruiz kept her voice low but firm. You were informed this was a military burial attended by high-ranking officials. Why did you escalate the situation? Ryan swallowed once. I thought she was trespassing, he answered quietly. Even to his own ears, the explanation sounded weak now. Ruiz stared at him for a long moment. You thought a grieving black woman near a military coffin did not belong there. Ryan looked away instantly. Nearby, Naomi remained beside her brother's casket while the honor guard folded into final formation around her. The bugler raised his trumpet once more. This time the notes of taps carried slowly through the cemetery without interruption, soft and aching beneath the gray sky. Naomi closed her eyes as the music drifted across the rain-soaked hills. The old wristwatch remained clutched tightly in her palm. Memories moved behind her expression like shadows. 2 children racing bicycles through Louisiana heat. Elijah stealing peaches from roadside fruit stands when they were broke. Their mother humming gospel songs in a tiny kitchen while summer storms rattled the windows. She could still hear his laugh even now beneath the trumpet's lonely melody. A single tear finally slipped down her face, disappearing into the rain before anyone could mention it. And standing several yards away beneath flashing police lights and silent cameras, Ryan Keller realized the woman he had humiliated in front of the nation had not once asked for revenge, raised her voice, or demanded respect. She had only come to bury her brother in peace. The final note of the trumpet faded slowly into the cold afternoon air as the honor guard folded the American flag with precise movements sharpened by years of discipline. Rain continued falling lightly across Arlington, tapping against polished headstones and dark umbrellas like soft fingertips against glass. General Naomi Carter remained beside her brother's casket long after most mourners lowered their heads. She stood still beneath the gray sky with Elijah's weathered wristwatch in one hand and the folded flag in the other, her posture steady even as grief pressed visibly against her shoulders. Nearby, Captain Elena Ruiz spoke quietly into a radio, while federal officers remained positioned beside Officer Ryan Keller. He no longer looked like the confident man who arrived earlier that afternoon. The rigid authority in his stance had drained away, replaced by something smaller and uncertain. His damp police jacket clung heavily to his frame, while the flashing lights from parked patrol vehicles reflected faintly across puddles forming near the cemetery road. Several reporters continued filming from behind the barricades now, their camera lenses fixed on Naomi rather than the funeral itself. Word had spread quickly. Decorated 4-star general. National military hero. Public confrontation during her brother's burial. Ryan could almost feel the story growing larger by the second around him. Body camera footage has already been requested. One federal officer murmured quietly to Captain Ruiz. Ryan heard the sentence clearly despite the rain. His throat tightened immediately. Ruiz glanced toward him briefly. The Department of Defense is involved now, she said calmly. So is Internal Affairs. Ryan opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came out. Across the cemetery lawn, Naomi finally stepped away from the casket as soldiers carefully prepared for the final military procession. The older general walked beside her beneath a black umbrella, though she barely seemed to notice the rain anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on the folded flag resting against her chest. A young boy around 8 years old suddenly broke free from his mother near the front row and ran carefully toward Naomi through the wet grass. His small suit jacket flapped in the wind as he stopped a few feet away from her. "Ma'am?" he asked nervously. Naomi looked down gently. The boy swallowed hard. "My dad served with your brother overseas." He held out a small challenge coin in his trembling hand. "He wanted you to have this." Naomi stared at the coin for a moment before taking it carefully between her fingers. The engraved eagle on its surface glimmered faintly beneath the cloudy sky. "What is your father's name?" she asked softly. "Marcus Hill," the boy answered. Naomi's face changed instantly with recognition. "Marcus carried Elijah out of a collapsed building during the Kandahar rescue," she said quietly. "Your father saved my brother's life once." The boy's eyes widened. Naomi knelt slowly despite the wet ground soaking through her coat. "Tell your father I never forgot that." The child nodded quickly before hurrying back toward his mother. Several nearby soldiers watched the exchange silently. One Marine wiped at his eyes before looking away toward the hills. Ryan stood frozen several yards back, witnessing all of it from behind the federal officers now monitoring him closely. Every moment seemed to deepen the weight already pressing against his chest. Naomi had every reason to humiliate him publicly, every reason to demand punishment immediately. But she never even looked toward him again. That hurt more than anger would have. Captain Ruiz received another message through her earpiece, and her expression darkened slightly. "Officer Keller," she said carefully, "we are going to need you to surrender your service weapon pending investigation." Ryan blinked once. The cemetery suddenly felt colder around him. He looked past her toward Naomi standing quietly among rows of saluting soldiers while rain drifted softly through the darkening sky. For the first time in his career, he understood what true authority actually looked like. It was not volume. It was not fear. It was not a badge or flashing lights. It was the quiet strength of someone who carried pain without ever handing it to others. And standing there in the rain beside her brother's grave, Naomi Carter carried more dignity and silence than Ryan Keller had ever carried in power. By early evening, the rain had thinned into a cold silver mist drifting low across the cemetery hills, while black government SUVs lined the narrow roads outside Arlington. Their headlights reflected across wet pavement and marble stone like pale ribbons of light stretching into the dark. Most mourners had already left, but clusters of military officers still remained near the burial site, speaking quietly beneath umbrellas. General Naomi Carter stood alone near Elijah's grave now, the folded flag tucked carefully beneath one arm, while the old wristwatch rested securely inside her coat pocket close to her heart. The cemetery workers had begun removing chairs from the muddy grass, their movements respectful and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again beyond Washington's skyline. Naomi stared down at the fresh earth covering her brother's grave for a long moment, without speaking. Her face looked calm from a distance, but exhaustion lived in the way her shoulders sagged whenever she thought nobody was watching. Captain Elena Ruiz approached slowly through the damp grass, carrying a sealed folder against her chest. "Ma'am," she said gently. Naomi looked up. Ruiz hesitated before continuing. "Internal Affairs officially suspended Officer Keller 30 minutes ago." Naomi gave a small nod, but no visible reaction. Ruiz studied her carefully. "Most people in your position would already be demanding statements from the press." Naomi glanced toward the rows of cameras still waiting near the cemetery entrance. "Today was never about me," she answered softly. "It was about Elijah." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling nearby flags sharply against their poles. Ruiz lowered her eyes briefly before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." She handed Naomi the sealed folder. Federal investigators reopened 3 prior complaints involving Keller after today's footage surfaced. Naomi opened the folder slowly beneath the dim evening light. Inside were photographs, reports, and witness statements. Her expression tightened almost immediately. One complaint involved an elderly veteran publicly detained outside a grocery store after being mistaken for a trespasser despite wearing full military honors. Another involved a teenage black college student held for hours after a routine traffic stop escalated into accusations later proven false. The third file remained partially sealed. Naomi stared quietly at the pages while rain tapped softly against the paper edges. These incidents were buried? She asked quietly. Ruiz nodded once. Lack of evidence at the time. But after today, people started talking. Naomi closed the folder carefully. Her eyes drifted back toward Elijah's grave. Pain spreads when nobody stops it, she murmured. Nearby, Ryan Keller sat alone inside the back seat of an unmarked federal vehicle parked beneath a row of dripping oak trees near the cemetery gates. His police badge rested beside him on the leather seat, already surrendered. He stared blankly through rain-streaked windows while reporters gathered farther down the road, hoping for statements. The silence inside the vehicle pressed heavily against him. His career had unraveled within hours. But deeper than fear was the image that refused to leave his mind. Naomi Carter standing beside her brother's casket without anger in her eyes, even after public humiliation. No shouting, no threats, no hatred, only grief and dignity. Ryan rubbed both hands slowly across his face. For years he had convinced himself authority meant control, compliance, dominance. But today every soldier in Arlington had saluted a woman who never demanded power once. A federal agent opened the vehicle door halfway. Keller, he said quietly, you are being transported downtown for formal questioning. Ryan nodded numbly and stepped out into the cold evening rain. Across the cemetery road, Naomi noticed the movement near the federal vehicle. Their eyes met briefly through drifting mist and flashing camera lights. Ryan immediately looked away in shame. Naomi said nothing. She only tightened her grip around the folded flag and turned back toward her brother's grave one final time. The wind lifted softly through the cemetery trees as darkness settled across Arlington, carrying with it the low rustling sound of hundreds of American flags moving together beneath the storm. By the next morning the storm had passed over Washington, but the city still carried the heavy gray silence left behind after cold rain. News vans lined the streets outside federal headquarters while television anchors repeated the same footage across every major network in the country. The image had already spread nationwide overnight. A decorated black female general standing beside her brother's coffin while a police officer confronted her in front of military mourners. Millions had watched it by sunrise. Inside a quiet conference room at the Pentagon, General Naomi Carter sat alone near a wide window overlooking the river. Early morning light reflected softly across polished wood floors and rows of framed military photographs hanging along the walls. The folded American flag rested carefully on the table beside her untouched coffee. She had not slept. The old wristwatch belonging to Elijah remained clasped around her fingers, while his challenge coin sat beside it under the pale morning light. Across from her, Secretary of Defense Harold Whitmore removed his glasses slowly and sighed. The president personally called this morning, he said quietly. Naomi said nothing at first. Her eyes remained fixed on the fog drifting over the Potomac River beyond the glass. Whitmore leaned forward carefully. Public response is growing rapidly. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, active duty officers. Everyone wants a statement from you. Naomi finally looked toward him. My brother died serving this country, she answered softly. I do not want his funeral remembered as a spectacle. Whitmore nodded with visible understanding. Unfortunately, it already is. The room fell silent again except for the faint hum of heating vents and distant helicopters moving across the city skyline outside. Naomi lowered her gaze toward Elijah's watch. When we were children, she said quietly, my brother used to tell me storms always passed faster if you stayed still long enough. Whitmore smiled faintly at the memory. Sounds wise. He usually was. A knock interrupted the silence. Captain Elena Ruiz entered carrying another folder under one arm. Her expression looked heavier than the day before. Ma'am, she said gently. Additional evidence surfaced overnight. Naomi accepted the folder without speaking. Inside were internal reports, disciplinary complaints, and witness testimony connected to Ryan Keller spanning nearly 7 years. Some pages carried signatures from officers who had tried unsuccessfully to raise concerns long before Arlington. Naomi read quietly while sunlight slowly brightened the conference room windows behind her. One report described repeated unnecessary confrontations with black veterans near government facilities. Another detailed verbal harassment complaints dismissed internally without review. A third included testimony from a retired officer who claimed Keller once publicly questioned whether a decorated black serviceman had really earned his medals. Naomi closed the folder carefully after several minutes. Her expression remained calm, but sadness moved behind her eyes deeper now than anger ever could. "How many people tried to speak before anyone listened?" she asked softly. Ruiz lowered her gaze. "Too many." Meanwhile, several miles away in a federal holding office downtown, Ryan Keller sat alone beneath harsh fluorescent lighting, staring at his reflection in a dark computer monitor. His tie had been removed. His badge was gone. Outside the small interview room, muffled voices drifted through the hallway while investigators reviewed footage frame by frame. Ryan rubbed his hands together slowly, unable to escape the image repeating endlessly across every television screen in the building. Naomi Carter standing in the rain without hatred in her face. Federal investigators had questioned him for hours already, but the silence afterward felt worse than the questions themselves. A younger officer entered briefly carrying bottled water and paused awkwardly near the door. "My father served under General Carter in Iraq," he said quietly without looking directly at Ryan. "He says she once carried wounded soldiers through smoke when helicopters could not land." Ryan stared down at the metal table in front of him. The officer hesitated before leaving. "He also said she never left anyone behind." The door closed softly again. Ryan remained motionless beneath the cold fluorescent lights, while somewhere far across the city, Naomi Carter sat beside a window overlooking the nation her brother died defending, holding his old watch quietly in her hands as morning sunlight finally broke through the clouds. 3 days later, the hearing room inside the federal courthouse felt colder than the storm that had passed over Arlington. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched beneath bright overhead lights while reporters filled nearly every seat with notebooks, cameras, and whispered conversations. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered since sunrise carrying American flags, military photographs, and handwritten signs demanding accountability. The atmosphere inside carried a different kind of silence, though. Heavy, controlled. The kind that settles over a room when everyone understands history is unfolding in real time. Officer Ryan Keller sat at the far end of the chamber wearing a dark suit that no longer carried the authority of a uniform. His shoulders looked smaller than before, weighed down by sleepless nights and endless headlines replaying the same moment again and again across the country. Federal prosecutors sat nearby, surrounded by thick folders stacked high with reopened complaints, internal reports, witness testimony, and archived footage dating back years. The investigation had grown larger than anyone expected. Across the aisle, General Naomi Carter entered quietly without an escort despite the cameras immediately turning toward her. Conversation stopped almost instantly. She wore a simple black suit with a small silver pin near the collar and carried Elijah's old wristwatch tucked inside her coat pocket. No medals, no military decorations, just quiet dignity. As she passed through the courtroom, several veterans seated near the back rose silently to their feet out of respect. Then another stood. Then another. Soon nearly half the room was standing without a single word spoken. Naomi paused briefly, surprised by the gesture, before nodding softly in gratitude and taking her seat. Ryan watched the moment unfold from across the courtroom with visible shame tightening across his face. The hearing began with hours of testimony. Investigators revealed disciplinary complaints that had remained ignored for years. Former officers described patterns of unnecessary escalation. Witnesses spoke quietly about fear, humiliation, and public mistreatment they had endured without believing anyone powerful would ever listen. One retired black veteran in his 70s adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers before addressing the court directly. "I spent 26 years serving this country," he said softly. "But that day Officer Keller stopped me outside a pharmacy. He looked at me like I did not belong in the uniform I earned." The room fell silent after that. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the table. He no longer looked defensive, only hollow. Then federal prosecutors played the cemetery footage in full. Rain falling over Arlington. Soldiers standing frozen beneath gray skies. Naomi Carter beside her brother's casket holding a folded flag while Ryan confronted her publicly. The room remained completely still as the video ended with rows of military officers saluting her in silence. Nobody spoke for several seconds afterward. Naomi stared down at her hands quietly, while Elijah's watch rested warm against her palm inside her coat pocket. Finally, the judge leaned forward. His voice carried calm authority sharpened by disappointment. "Officer Keller," he said carefully, "this court is not examining one isolated incident. It is examining years of conduct shaped by prejudice, abuse of authority, and repeated disregard for the dignity of others." Ryan swallowed hard, but did not interrupt. The judge continued reviewing additional evidence connected to prior cases that investigators had reopened after Arlington. Hidden reports, suppressed testimony, neglected complaints. A pattern too consistent to ignore any longer. Cameras clicked softly across the courtroom while reporters scribbled furiously. Then came the sentence recommendation from federal prosecutors. Life imprisonment tied to cumulative federal convictions connected to civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and misconduct uncovered during the investigation. The words settled heavily across the courtroom like falling stone. Ryan closed his eyes briefly as though the weight of his own choices had finally become impossible to outrun. Across the aisle, Naomi remained completely still. No satisfaction crossed her face. No triumph. Only sadness. Because even now, after everything revealed in that courtroom, she still seemed to understand something many people never learn. Hatred destroys more than its target. It eventually destroys the person carrying it too. The courthouse steps glistened beneath the late afternoon sun as crowds gathered behind metal barricades stretching nearly an entire city block. Reporters shouted questions over one another while camera flashes burst constantly against the stone columns outside the federal building. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder beside ordinary citizens holding small American flags close against the chilly wind. Some had traveled hundreds of miles overnight after seeing the footage from Arlington. Others came because they saw something familiar in General Naomi Carter's quiet pain. Inside the courthouse lobby, the heavy wooden doors opened slowly as federal officers escorted Ryan Keller through the corridor toward a secured transport vehicle waiting outside. He no longer wore a badge or carried the sharp posture that once defined him. His suit hung loose around tired shoulders, and deep shadows rested beneath his eyes from nights without sleep. The sentence had already spread across every news channel in the nation. Life imprisonment. Years of buried misconduct uncovered because one funeral confrontation forced people to finally look closer. As Ryan moved through the hallway, several officers standing guard remained silent. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others watched him with visible disappointment. None looked triumphant. Near the far end of the corridor, General Naomi Carter stood quietly beside a marble pillar waiting for her security escort. Sunlight poured through the courthouse windows behind her, wrapping soft gold around the edges of her dark coat. Elijah's wristwatch remained fastened around her left wrist now, slightly too large, but steady against her skin. Ryan slowed instinctively when he saw her standing there. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The hallway noise faded beneath the distant clicking of cameras outside and the low hum of courthouse elevators moving between floors. Finally, Ryan lowered his eyes. "General Carter," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion, "I do not expect forgiveness." Naomi studied him calmly. There was no anger in her expression, only the kind of sadness that comes from seeing damage too late to fully repair. Ryan swallowed hard before continuing. What happened at Arlington should never have happened. His hands trembled faintly against the handcuffs resting in front of him. "I spent years believing authority made me better than the people I judged." He looked up briefly, shame visible across his face. "But the truth is I stopped seeing people at all." Naomi remained silent for several seconds. Sunlight shifted softly across the marble floor between them, while federal officers respectfully kept their distance. "My brother believed people could change," Naomi finally said quietly. Ryan blinked once, surprised by the softness in her voice. Naomi glanced toward the courthouse windows where American flags moved gently outside in the wind. Elijah used to tell young soldiers that fear becomes dangerous when people refuse to question it. She looked back at Ryan calmly. What destroys a nation is not only hatred. It is silence from those who see it and do nothing. Ryan lowered his head completely after hearing that. The weight of her words settled heavier than the sentence itself. Naomi stepped slightly closer, though her voice never rose above calm conversation. "You cannot undo the pain caused to those people," she said. "But maybe one day you can finally understand it." Ryan's eyes glistened faintly under the courthouse lights. He nodded once without speaking. Nearby, even the federal officers watching seemed affected by the quiet exchange unfolding between them. Naomi could have humiliated him publicly. She could have delivered speeches, demanded vengeance, or fed the outrage spreading across the country. Instead, she offered something far more difficult. Truth without cruelty. Accountability without hatred. A federal marshal finally approached carefully. "It is time," he said softly to Ryan. Ryan gave a small nod before turning toward the exit. Just before the hallway doors opened, he paused briefly and looked back once more at Naomi Carter standing peacefully beneath the courthouse light, with Elijah's old watch resting against her wrist. Then the doors closed behind him, and the sound of distant cameras flooded the hallway as the nation watched one man disappear into the consequences of his own choices, while the woman he once humiliated remained standing with quiet dignity untouched. 2 weeks later, the sky above Arlington National Cemetery glowed soft amber beneath the final light of evening. Autumn leaves drifted slowly across the narrow stone paths, while a cold breeze moved gently through rows of white marble headstones stretching toward the horizon. The crowds were gone now. No reporters, no flashing cameras, no television trucks waiting outside iron gates. Only silence remained, deep and clean after weeks of noise. General Naomi Carter walked alone through the cemetery, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped carefully in brown paper. Her dark coat moved softly with the wind as her boots pressed quietly against damp gravel paths, still carrying traces of recent rain. Elijah's old wristwatch rested securely around her wrist, the worn leather strap faded from years of use. She stopped beside his grave and lowered herself slowly onto the small folding chair left there earlier by cemetery staff. For several moments, she simply sat in silence, looking at the engraved name carved into the stone. Sergeant First Class Elijah Carter. Beloved son, brother, soldier. The evening light touched the letters gently, while distant church bells echoed faintly somewhere beyond the hills. Naomi placed the flowers carefully at the base of the headstone before brushing fallen leaves away with slow movements of her gloved hand. The world had changed quickly after the funeral. Federal agencies announced sweeping internal reviews. New oversight policies were introduced nationwide. Buried complaints resurfaced. Officers who once stayed silent finally began speaking openly. Veterans groups organized support programs for families who had experienced similar humiliation. The country called it reform, progress, accountability. But sitting there beside her brother's grave, Naomi knew change rarely arrived because people suddenly became wiser. Sometimes it arrived because pain finally became impossible to ignore. A faint crunch of gravel sounded behind her. Naomi turned slightly and saw the young boy from the funeral approaching carefully with his father beside him. Marcus Hill looked older than his service photographs now, gray beginning to spread through his beard, but his posture remained sharp with military discipline. "General Carter," he said softly. Naomi smiled gently. "Marcus." The little boy stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for Sergeant Elijah," he said shyly. Naomi accepted it carefully. The drawing showed 2 soldiers standing beneath an American flag beside a sunrise colored in uneven shades of orange and blue. At the bottom, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "Heroes help people stand back up." Naomi stared quietly at the paper for a moment before her eyes softened with emotion. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Marcus glanced toward Elijah's grave before speaking carefully. "A lot of people are talking about what happened now." Naomi nodded once. "I know." Marcus lowered his eyes briefly. "My son asked me yesterday why you never yelled at that officer after everything he did." The evening wind lifted softly through the cemetery trees, while distant flags rustled together beneath the fading sky. Naomi looked down at Elijah's watch resting against her wrist. "Because anger can expose injustice," she answered quietly. "But dignity is what people remember afterward." Marcus absorbed the words silently, while his son looked up at Naomi with wide, thoughtful eyes. Nearby, the final golden light of sunset spread slowly across the endless rows of white stone, bathing the cemetery in quiet warmth. The little boy suddenly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small American flag attached to a wooden stick. Without speaking, he pressed it gently into the earth beside Elijah's grave. Then he stepped back beside his father. Naomi watched the tiny flag move softly in the evening breeze. For a long moment, nobody spoke at all. The air smelled of cold grass, fallen leaves, and distant rain carried on the wind. Somewhere beyond the hills, a bugle sounded faintly in the distance as another funeral ceremony ended far away across Arlington. Naomi finally looked up toward the fading sky above the cemetery. The storm that began with humiliation and grief had passed now. What remained behind was quieter than victory. It was understanding. And beneath the soft evening light beside her brother's grave, General Naomi Carter sat peacefully in the silence he left behind while hundreds of American flags moved together across the hills like waves beneath the darkening sky.